On the morning of August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima awakened to what seemed like another ordinary summer day. The temperature was already climbing past 77 degrees Fahrenheit by 7 in the morning, and the humidity wrapped around the city like a heavy blanket. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of the Hiroshima Communications Hospital, was preparing for his morning rounds, adjusting his white coat and reviewing patient charts that would never be completed. The citizens of Hiroshima believed they had been spared the worst of the conflict. While other major Japanese cities had experienced extensive air operations, Hiroshima remained largely untouched, leading many to speculate that the Americans were saving the city as a potential occupation headquarters. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What the approximately 350,000 residents didn't know was that their city had been selected precisely because it remained intact, chosen to demonstrate something that would fundamentally change not just their lives, but the entire course of human history. At 8:14 and 17 seconds, air raid sirens began to wail across the city. Most residents barely glanced up. Single aircraft or small formations had become routine, usually weather planes or reconnaissance missions. Tetsuo Miyamoto, a 16-year-old student mobilized for building demolition work, was standing with his work crew about 1.3 miles from the city center. "We heard the engines," he would later recount, "but it sounded like just another observation plane. My supervisor didn't even tell us to take cover." Shigeko Sasamori, a 13-year-old schoolgirl, was walking with her classmates to their assigned work area, clearing fire breaks in the city. The students chatted about their lessons, their families, the increasing scarcity of rice. Above them, at 31,000 feet, a B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay released a single object weighing 9,700 pounds. At 8:15 and 43 seconds, everything changed. Sunao Tsuboi, a 20-year-old university student, was on his way to school, walking across a bridge about 1 kilometer from what would become Ground Zero. First, there was a flash, he would describe decades later. Not like lightning. This was different. It was like the sun had suddenly fallen to earth. The light was white, pure white, but also purple and every color at once. It came from everywhere, not just above. The flash lasted less than 1 second, but its intensity was beyond human comprehension. The temperature at the point of explosion reached approximately 1 million degrees Celsius, 60 times hotter than the surface of the sun. Within 1 second, the temperature at ground level beneath the explosion reached 4,000 degrees Celsius. Dr. Hachiya was sitting at his desk when the flash filled his office. "The papers on my desk burst into flames," he would write in his diary. "Not caught fire, burst into flames instantly. I thought at first that a bomb had fallen directly on the hospital. But then I realized the light was coming through the windows from outside, from everywhere." Akiko Takakura, a 20-year-old bank employee, was standing near a window on the second floor of the Hiroshima Bank building, about 300 meters from the hypocenter. "The light entered my eyes and I felt my eyeballs burning," she testified years later. "I put my hands to my face, and through my closed eyelids and through my hands, I could still see the bones in my fingers, like an X-ray. Everything turned red, then black. The blast wave followed the flash by approximately 3 seconds, traveling at speeds initially exceeding 700 miles per hour. Windows shattered up to 12 miles away. Buildings within 1 mile of Ground Zero were instantly flattened. The pressure wave was so intense that it created winds of over 600 miles per hour at ground level." Yoshito Matsushige, a photographer for the Chugoku Shimbun newspaper, was at his home 2.7 kilometers from the hypocenter when the blast wave hit. "First the flash, then silence, then a sound like nothing I had ever heard," he recounted. "Not like thunder, deeper, like the earth itself was roaring. Then my house began to shake, and the roof tiles started dancing. I saw my neighbor's house simply disappear. One moment it was there, the next it was kindling." The blast wave stripped clothing from bodies, tore children from their mothers' arms, and transformed everyday objects into lethal projectiles. Glass fragments embedded themselves in walls miles from the explosion, Roof tiles became deadly missiles. The very air itself seemed to turn solid, crushing and tearing at everything in its path. 13-year-old Shigeko Sasamori was knocked unconscious by the blast. When she regained consciousness, she couldn't understand what had happened to her surroundings. "Everything was dark," she would later say. "I thought it was night, but I knew it had just been morning. Then I realized the darkness was dust and smoke. I tried to stand, but couldn't. I looked at my hands and saw the skin hanging from them like gloves turned inside out. The heat from the explosion was so intense that it left permanent shadows on concrete and stone. The silhouettes of humans vaporized in an instant, their last moments etched forever into the city's ruins. A person sitting on stone steps at the entrance to a bank left only a dark shadow on the stones. The shadows pointed toward the hypocenter like accusing fingers. Dr. Terufumi Sasaki, working at the Red Cross Hospital, was one of the few medical professionals in the building not injured by the blast. "I was walking down a hallway when the flash came," he reported. "I dropped to the floor instinctively. When I stood up, the hospital was full of broken glass and fallen plaster. Then they started coming, the people. At first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. What Dr. Sasaki and others began to witness defied medical understanding. People arrived with burns unlike anything seen before. The pattern of clothing had been burned directly onto skin. Dark colors absorbed more heat. Those wearing white clothing on one side of their body and dark on the other showed burns only where the dark fabric had been. A woman wearing a patterned kimono had the design permanently etched onto her back. Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto, pastor of the Hiroshima Methodist Church, was helping a friend move belongings to a house outside the city center when he saw the flash. "I threw myself between two large rocks," he would write. "After the blast passed, I stood up and looked toward the city. Where Hiroshima had been, there was only smoke and fire. I thought the entire city had been hit by hundreds of bombs. I couldn't conceive that one bomb had done this." As the initial shock began to wear off, survivors started to comprehend the scale of devastation. The city's center had essentially ceased to exist. Buildings designed to withstand earthquakes had been reduced to rubble. Steel beams were twisted like straws. Concrete had been pulverized to dust. In an area of approximately 2 miles in diameter, virtually every structure was destroyed or severely damaged. Michiko Yamaoka, a 15-year-old mobilized student, found herself trapped under collapsed debris. "I could hear voices calling for help all around me," she remembered. Some were calling for their mothers, others for water. The voices grew fewer as time passed. I called out too, but my voice was so small. I thought I would become one of the voices that stopped. The firestorm began within 20 minutes of the explosion. The intense heat had ignited everything combustible within a large radius, and these individual fires began to merge into a single massive conflagration. The firestorm created its own weather system, with winds rushing inward to feed the flames, and a pillar of smoke and debris rising miles into the sky. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a 29-year-old naval engineer, was preparing to leave Hiroshima after a business trip when the bomb exploded. Though 3 kilometers from ground zero, he suffered severe burns. "I saw a tremendous flash of light," he would later testify. "The blast knocked me unconscious. When I awoke, I couldn't see the sun through the smoke and dust. I started walking toward the train station, but the city I knew was gone. In its place was hell." What Yamaguchi and other survivors encountered as they moved through the city challenged human comprehension. People wandered aimlessly, their clothes burned away, their skin hanging in sheets. Many were blinded. Others were in such shock they seemed unaware of their injuries. The lucky ones had been killed instantly. Sankichi Toge, a poet who survived the bombing, would later write verses trying to capture what he witnessed, though he acknowledged words were inadequate. "How can I describe it? The multitudes fleeing, skin hanging like rags, arms held out before them, silent ghosts in a destroyed world. Water became the universal cry. Mizu, Mizu! Water, water!" rose from thousands of throats. People flocked to the 7 rivers that ran through Hiroshima, seeking relief from burns and overwhelming thirst. Many who entered the water were too weak to resist the current and were swept away. The rivers became clogged with bodies. Dr. Hachia, despite his own injuries, tried to organize medical care at his hospital. "We had no medicine, no bandages, no way to help," he wrote. "People kept arriving, begging for aid we couldn't provide. We tried to separate the living from those who had passed, but there were too many. Far too many." One of the most incomprehensible aspects for survivors was the apparent randomness of destruction and survival. A person standing behind a concrete wall might survive, while someone in the open nearby perished instantly. Children playing in the shadow of a building lived while those in sunlight ceased to exist. This randomness would haunt survivors for decades. Why them and not others? Sadako Kurihara, a poet who was in her home 4.7 kilometers from the hypocenter, rushed toward the city center to search for relatives. "I saw things that cannot be unseen," she would write. A mother carrying a baby, not realizing the child had already gone. An old man sitting perfectly still by the road, his eyes open but seeing nothing. Children calling names that would never be answered. Among the most tragic sights were the children. Thousands of students had been mobilized for work duty in the city center, clearing fire breaks and performing other tasks. Entire classes were eliminated in seconds. Parents searched frantically among the ruins, calling names, checking bodies, hoping against hope. Nobuko Yamamoto was searching for her 12-year-old son, who had been working with his school group near the center of the city. "I went to where his school group was supposed to be working," she recounted years later. "There was nothing. No buildings, no streets I recognized, nothing. Other parents were there too, calling out. We helped each other search. We found some children, but not mine. Not mine." As the day wore on, a new phenomenon appeared that added to the terror and confusion. Black rain began to fall, precipitation mixed with radioactive dust and debris from the mushroom cloud. Desperately thirsty survivors opened their mouths to catch the drops, not knowing they were ingesting radioactive material. Fujio Torikoshi, a medical student who was 2 kilometers from the hypocenter when the bomb exploded, described the rain. "It was black, sticky, like oil. It left marks on everything it touched. People thought it would help with the fires, but it seemed to make no difference. The city continued to burn." The breakdown of normal social structures happened rapidly, but not completely. Even in the midst of unprecedented catastrophe, acts of kindness and selflessness emerged. Students helped elderly strangers. Mothers shared precious water with other people's children. Buddhist priests and Christian ministers worked side by side to comfort the suffering. Father Wilhelm Kleinsorger, a German Jesuit priest who had been living in Hiroshima despite his own injuries, spent hours helping evacuate people from the burning city. "I saw the best and worst of humanity that day," he would later reflect. "People stealing water from the injured, but also people giving their last strength to help strangers." As night fell on August 6th, the full scale of the catastrophe remained unknown. Communications were destroyed. Government buildings were gone. Many of the city's leaders had perished. Rumors spread that more bombs were coming, that the Americans had used poison gas, that the entire country was under attack. Dr. Sasaki worked through the night at the Red Cross Hospital, one of the few concrete buildings still partially standing. "We performed operations without anesthesia by candlelight," he reported. "We had no choice. People would have passed away waiting. I stopped counting how many amputations I performed. At some point you become numb to it all. You have to continue." The psychological impact on survivors was immediate and profound. Many experienced what would later be understood as acute stress disorder. Some became mute, unable or unwilling to speak about what they had witnessed. Others couldn't stop talking, compulsively describing the horrors they had seen. Tomiko Morimoto, a 13-year-old schoolgirl who was 1.5 kilometers from the hypocenter, survived because she was inside a reinforced concrete building. "After I got home that night, our house was damaged but standing. I couldn't speak," she remembered. "My mother kept asking what happened, but no words would come. How could I explain? How could anyone who wasn't there understand?" In the days following the explosion, as medical professionals began to examine survivors, new mysteries emerged. People who seemed to have escaped with minor injuries suddenly fell ill. Hair fell out, gums bled. White blood cell counts plummeted. Purple spots appeared on skin. The atomic bomb had introduced the world to radiation sickness. though neither victims nor doctors initially understood what was happening. Dr. Hachia meticulously documented these cases in his diary. Patients who seem to be recovering suddenly take a turn for the worse. We see symptoms we cannot explain. Healthy people becoming sick without warning. It's as if the bomb is still killing people days after it exploded. The death toll continued to rise for weeks after the initial explosion. Estimates vary, but by the end of 1945, approximately 140,000 people had perished from the bombing, nearly half the city's population. The exact number will never be known, as entire families were eliminated, leaving no one to report their losses. Among the survivors, a new term emerged: hibakusha, explosion-affected people. This label would follow them throughout their lives, affecting marriage prospects, employment opportunities, and social relationships. The stigma of radiation exposure created a new category of discrimination in Japanese society. Sumiko Kirihara, who was 24 years old and working in a government office 1.4 kilometers from the hypocenter, survived with severe burns. "After I recovered, people were afraid of me," she said decades later. "They thought radiation was contagious. Parents didn't want their children to marry hibakusha. Employers didn't want to hire us. We survived the bomb only to face a different kind of suffering." The testimonies of survivors would eventually fill volumes, each account adding another dimension to the collective memory of that day. Common themes emerged: the unprecedented nature of the destruction, the breakdown of normal reference points for understanding disaster, the randomness of survival, and the long shadow the event cast over subsequent lives. Yoshito Matsushige, the photographer who witnessed the destruction from his home, ventured into the city with his camera later that day. He would take only 5 photographs, the only known images of Hiroshima on the day of the bombing taken by a local resident. "I tried to take more," he explained, "but I couldn't. The viewfinder would cloud with my tears. How do you photograph hell?" One of Matsushige's photographs showed people gathered at Miyuki Bridge, their clothes burned away, skin hanging from their bodies, waiting for help that was slow to come. The image would become iconic, but Matsushige himself could barely look at it in later years. "Every time I see it, I'm back there, smelling the burning, hearing the cries for water," he said. The psychological concept of survivor guilt affected virtually every hibakusha. Why had they lived when family members, friends, neighbors, and strangers had perished? This question haunted them for decades, influencing life decisions and personal relationships. Keiji Nakazawa, who was 6 years old when the bomb fell and lost most of his family, would later create manga about his experiences. "I survived because I was behind a wall when the flash came," he explained. "My classmate standing 3 feet away in the open was killed instantly. 3 feet. That was the difference between life and death." How do you make sense of that? The testimonies of Hiroshima survivors also reveal the long process of psychological adaptation. Many could not speak about their experiences for years or even decades. Others became compulsive witnesses, feeling obligated to share their stories despite the pain it caused them. Setsuko Thurlow, who was 13 years old and 1.8 kilometers from the hypocenter when the bomb exploded, became a lifelong advocate for nuclear disarmament. "At first I couldn't speak about it," she recalled. "Then I realized that those of us who survived had an obligation to those who didn't. We had to tell the world what nuclear weapons really mean, not in abstract terms, but in human suffering." The medical legacy of the atomic bombing extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Increased rates of cancer, particularly leukemia, appeared in the survivor population. Children exposed to radiation in utero showed developmental problems. Genetic effects were feared, though large-scale studies eventually showed these fears were largely unfounded. Dr. James Yamazaki, a Japanese-American physician who studied the medical effects of the bombing, noted, "The atomic bomb was not just a bigger explosive. It introduced types of injury never before seen. Radiation burns that wouldn't heal, bone marrow destruction, chromosomal damage. Hiroshima became an unwitting laboratory for understanding radiation effects on human beings." The environmental impact was equally unprecedented. In the hypocenter area, nothing grew for months. When plants finally began to return, They showed mutations, flowers with too many petals, leaves with altered shapes. The very soil remained radioactive. Rain washed contamination into rivers and eventually the sea. Yet amid this devastation, life gradually returned to Hiroshima. By 1946, survivors had begun rebuilding on the ruins. Shops opened in hastily constructed shacks. Schools resumed in damaged buildings. The human capacity for resilience in the face of unprecedented catastrophe became evident. Hideko Takahashi, who lost her entire family in the bombing and was severely burned herself, opened a small shop selling daily necessities to other survivors. "We had to live," she explained simply. "Those who died wouldn't want us to give up. So we continued one day at a time, one small step at a time." The role of medical professionals in documenting and treating radiation effects cannot be overstated. Doctors like Hachiya, Sasaki, and others not only treated victims, but carefully recorded symptoms and outcomes, creating a medical record that would prove invaluable for understanding radiation's effects on human health. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established in 1947, began systematic studies of survivors. These studies, continuing for decades, provided crucial data on long-term radiation effects, influencing radiation safety standards worldwide. Hibakusha became unwilling subjects in the longest-running study of radiation effects in human history. International awareness of what happened at Hiroshima grew slowly. Initial reports were censored by occupation authorities. It wasn't until John Hersey's article Hiroshima appeared in The New Yorker in 1946 that many Americans began to understand the human dimension of atomic warfare. The testimonies collected from survivors served multiple purposes. They were historical records, psychological catharsis for the speakers, educational tools, and moral arguments against nuclear weapons. Each survivor who spoke added another voice to a chorus warning humanity about the consequences of nuclear conflict. Tamiki Hara, a poet and writer who survived the bombing, struggled with how to convey the experience through literature. "Words fail," he wrote. "How can language designed for human experience describe something that negates humanity itself? Yet we must try, using our inadequate words, because silence serves no one." The question of memory, how to remember, what to remember, and why to remember, became central to Hiroshima's post-war identity. Should the city remain in ruins as a warning, or rebuild as a symbol of hope? The debate reflected larger questions about how societies process collective trauma. Ultimately, Hiroshima chose reconstruction while preserving key sites as memorials. The atomic bomb dome, the skeletal remains of the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, stands as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its twisted frame a permanent reminder of August 6, 1945. The establishment of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum in 1955 created a repository for survivor testimonies, artifacts, and documentation. Personal items, a child's lunchbox with carbonized rice, a pocket watch stopped at 8:15, shadows burned into stone, give physical form to abstract numbers. Sadako Sasaki, who was 2 years old when exposed to the bomb's radiation and developed leukemia at age 12, became an international symbol through her attempt to fold 1,000 paper cranes before her death. Her story, spreading worldwide, transformed the paper crane into a symbol of peace and the innocent victims of war. The voices of Hibakusha took on new urgency as the Cold War arms race accelerated. Survivors traveled internationally, sharing their testimonies with world leaders, students, and ordinary citizens. Their message was consistent: nuclear weapons must never be used again. Sunao Tsuboi, who met President Obama during his historic visit to Hiroshima in 2016, reflected on the meaning of survivor testimony. "We don't speak from hatred or desire for revenge. We speak so that no other city, no other people will ever experience what we experienced. That is our only wish." The collected testimonies of Hiroshima survivors reveal patterns in human response to unprecedented catastrophe. Initial shock and incomprehension give way to survival instincts. Acute trauma transforms into chronic psychological effects. Individual suffering becomes collective memory. Personal experience becomes historical testimony. Modern trauma psychology recognizes many symptoms in hibakusha, testimonies that are now understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, intrusive memories, avoidance behaviors, hypervigilance, survivor guilt. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima created an entire population dealing with collective trauma. Yet the testimonies also reveal remarkable resilience. Survivors rebuilt lives, created families, pursued careers, and found meaning in existence despite carrying physical and psychological scars. Their stories are not just about destruction, but about the human capacity to endure and transcend suffering. Miyoko Matsubara, who was 12 when the bomb fell and lost her father and 2 siblings, became a nurse, dedicating her life to helping others. "I could have let bitterness consume me," she reflected at age 80. "Instead, I chose to honor the dead by serving the living. Every patient I helped was a small victory over the darkness of that day." The technological precision of the atomic bomb, years of scientific research, massive industrial effort, military planning, stood in stark contrast to its fundamentally indiscriminate nature. The testimonies of civilians repeatedly emphasize this paradox. The most advanced weapon ever created primarily killed those who had no part in creating the conflict. Children going to school, mothers preparing breakfast, elderly people tending gardens, workers beginning their day. These were the primary victims. The bomb made no distinction between combatant and civilian, guilty and innocent, adult and child. This indiscriminate nature fundamentally changed concepts of warfare. As hibakusha age and pass away, the question of how to preserve and transmit their testimonies becomes increasingly urgent. Digital archives, recorded interviews, and written accounts attempt to preserve their voices for future generations. Yet something ineffable is lost when the last witness to an event dies. The legacy of Hiroshima testimonies extends beyond historical documentation. They have influenced international law, particularly regarding nuclear weapons and the protection of civilians in conflict. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, adopted by the United Nations in 2017, explicitly references the humanitarian consequences experienced by hibakusha. Educational programs worldwide use survivor testimonies to teach about nuclear weapons effects. Abstract discussions of megatonnage and radiation levels become viscerally real when accompanied by a survivor's account of searching for family members in the ruins or watching radiation sickness claim a loved one. The intersection of individual memory and collective history creates complex dynamics. Each survivor's testimony is unique, yet part of a larger narrative. Personal details: a favorite kimono destroyed, a pet that disappeared, a tree that miraculously survived, humanize incomprehensible destruction. Chieko Kiriake, who was 21 and working in a bank 900 meters from the hypocenter, spent decades painting her memories of that day. "Words weren't enough," she explained. "I needed colors, shapes, images to show what I saw. Even then, the paintings are pale shadows of reality." The role of testimony in reconciliation and peace-building cannot be ignored. Many hibakusha explicitly rejected hatred toward America, instead focusing their energy on preventing future nuclear weapons use. This transformation of suffering into advocacy for peace represents a profound moral choice. When examining the immediate reactions and long-term testimonies of Hiroshima's civilians, certain truths emerge. The atomic bomb represented a fundamental break with previous human experience. Its effects, immediate and delayed, physical and psychological, individual and collective, created new categories of suffering. Yet the testimonies also affirm human dignity in the face of dehumanizing technology. Each story insists on the value of individual life, the importance of memory, and the possibility of meaning even after catastrophic loss. The voices of Hiroshima's civilians, preserved through decades of testimony, continue to speak to fundamental questions about technology, warfare, and humanity itself. As we reach the end of this historical account, the words of hibakusha echo across decades. Their testimonies, born from unimaginable suffering, carry a simple message: remember what happened here, learn from it, and ensure it never happens again. The civilians of Hiroshima, through their survival and their voices, transformed personal catastrophe into a universal warning about the nuclear age. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.